There's a certain exhaustion that doesn't come from overworking as much as it does from over accommodation. It's this tiredness of always reading the room, of gauging everyone else's comfort while ignoring your own, of being the one who smooths things over, keeps things calm, swallows the hard truths and says, it's fine, when deep down it's anything but fine. This is a quiet fatigue of the peacekeeper. And in today's episode, I want to name something that we don't talk about nearly enough, and that is that not all peacekeeping is noble. See, sometimes it's actually self-erasing, because there's a version of harmony that demands that you leave yourself out of the equation, where your emotions get edited out and where your needs get quietly demoted, where your voice, your truth, your boundaries, your hurt becomes secondary to preserving the appearance of unity. And when that becomes your way of surviving, you may still be present in the room, yes, but you're no longer really at home in yourself. See, peacekeeping in its healthiest form is really about creating space where differences can exist without division. And it's rooted in mutual respect and mutual truth-telling, mutual repair. But what we're often calling peacekeeping or keeping the peace is not that. It's not really rooted at all in mutuality. It's more rooted in fear. Fear of conflict, of being disliked, of rocking the boat. Fear that if we name what's wrong, it'll all fall apart. Fear that our hurt will become too inconvenient for others to hold. Now we'll be seen as difficult or dramatic or selfish or needy, and so we pretend that it's not a problem. We pretend to be okay. We pretend that it didn't hurt. We pretend that it's not a big deal. We pretend that we're chill, when in reality we're really crushed. And over time, this pretending becomes a performance that we don't even know that we're putting on. You know that feeling, for example, when you walk into a room and your body sort of tenses before your mouth even says a word? That's your nervous system telling you, here comes the role again. Here comes the character that I play to make things safe. I got to be the agreeable one, the one who's steady, the one who's I'm fine one. But what if you're not fine? What if staying agreeable is really costing you that inner alignment? See, there was a time that I didn't realize just how much of my life was wrapped around other people's comfort. I mistook my silence for strength. I believed that saying nothing when something hurt me was maturity. And that if I could just keep the peace, I was doing the most spiritual, most selfless thing ever. But the truth was, I wasn't keeping the peace. I was keeping secrets, mostly from myself. And those secrets, they weren't small. They were griefs that needed to be named, disappointments that needed to be grieved, and anger that needed to be felt. Truths that had to be spoken, not weaponized, but witnessed. Because unspoken truth doesn't disappear. It doesn't dissipate into thin air. It just sits and it swells and it curdles into some resentment. And soon we're not just tired, we're also bitter and not just quiet, but we're also emotionally numb. See, this is a real cost of peacekeeping that becomes pretending. We don't just lose our voice, we also lose our sense of aliveness. And what's worse is we often become unknowable, even to ourselves, because when we spend years avoiding the conflict with others, we in essence become experts at avoiding conflict within. And so we stop asking, what do I actually feel? And we start asking, what's the least disruptive thing that I can do right now? See, that question, the least disruptive path, becomes our compass. And slowly we lose sight of where we were, and we lose track of our mooring. And I've spoken with so many people who've told me the same story in different words. They stayed in jobs far too long, not because they were passionate about it, but because leaving would let people down. And they stayed in relationships far past the expiration point of that relationship, not because they were healthy, but because breaking up would be too messy. And they tolerated microaggressions and toxic dynamics and passive aggression and manipulation, not because they didn't feel it, but because speaking up would make it awkward. And so they kept the peace, and it broke them. And if that's you, I want you to hear this. Hear me on this. You're not weak for wanting harmony. That desire is beautiful. It often comes from trauma or survival, a lived reality where conflict once meant danger. But I think it's time we ask the hard question, and that is your version of peace actually hiding harm? See, here at Uber Bintegers, this is the exact kind of question that I want to sit with. Where does integrity end, and where does self-abandonment begin? Or where does intimacy invite truth instead of just tolerance? Where can we tell the truth, not just to others, but to ourselves? Because peacekeeping that costs your truth is not peace. That's control. And reclaiming your truth might be the most disruptive and the most healing thing that you could ever do. And there's a quiet kind of erosion that really happens when you spend your life prioritizing comfort over truth. Not just the comfort of others, but your own comfort with being needed, with being liked, with being seen as the calm one. And it's easy to miss this at first. You notice it in the smallest of ways, like the moment when you rehearse what you were going to say and then you say something softer instead. Or the moment that your stomach tightens when someone crosses a line and then you tell yourself, oh, it wasn't a big deal. And you think you're just choosing grace, but over time, grace becomes your cover story for fear. See, that's how it began for me. There were countless of moments in my past when I felt the sting of something being off. There's a subtle jab in conversation, for example, or a boundary that was casually ignored, a pattern that kept surfacing again for me asking the truth and not just politeness. And each time I had a choice to speak up or to smooth it over. And too often I would just choose to smooth it over. I told myself I was being patient and that this would pass, that people would change on their own timeline, and that I didn't want to really seem too reactive or too sensitive or too much. But the truth was, I was afraid of losing my seat at the table, afraid of being misjudged, afraid of confirming someone's suspicion that I was difficult. And so I performed peace. And in doing so, I was training myself to mute what mattered the most. And what I didn't realize was how addictive that pattern became. Once you've built your identity around being low maintenance, around being the stabilizer, around being easy to be around, it becomes terrifying to risk being anything else. And so you stop naming what hurts. You stop hoping for repair. You just adapt again and again until the adapting becomes your whole personality. And what's so deceptive is that people are going to praise you for this. They're going to say that you're easygoing, that you're such a good listener, that you're such a rock. But rocks don't bend. Rocks endure. And an endurance without expression is not peace. It's like a slow suffocation. There came a point where I began to see these cracks. It didn't look like an explosion. It looked more like a disconnection from my body, from my relationships, from my joy. Like I would show up physically, but emotionally I was just half faded. I was friendly and helpful, but not really there. I was starting to disappear inside my own life. And that was the moment that I knew something just had to change, because peacekeeping that demands your withdrawal is not peace. That that is exile. It took time, like years, like to unravel how deeply ingrained this was in me. And part of that process was understanding where it actually came from. See, so many of us were taught explicitly or implicitly that keeping the peace was the highest form of maturity. We saw what happened when people fought, right? We saw what happened when someone made things awkward. We saw how people got shamed and ostracized or silenced for saying what others didn't really want to hear. And so we became the masters of containment. We learned how to read the room before we entered it. We made our personalities adjustable. We thought this is what made us safe. But safety that really comes at a cost of your honesty is not safety, is it? It's just a more socially acceptable version of abandonment, abandoning yourself, literally. And the more we do this, the more we normalize all of this in our communities. And that's one of the hardest truths I think I had to face. That my peacekeeping didn't just hurt me, it was also hurting others around me. Because when you're the one who stays silent, others who are trying to speak up often feel more alone. And when you pretend not to notice what's wrong, the people who are naming it seem overly emotional by comparison. And when you don't model honesty, you're contributing to a culture where honesty is punished. And that was a turning point for me when I realized this. I realized I didn't want to be a safe space for the dysfunction anymore. I didn't want to be the emotional filter that made everything sort of palatable. I didn't want my silence to become someone else's validation that everything is fine, because it wasn't. And pretending that it didn't, pretending that it was fine didn't make me strong. It just made me complicit. And that's when I began to explore what integrity could look like in real time. Not aggressive or dramatic, just honest. And it began with small statements like this feels off to me, or I'm not okay with that, or I need to be honest about what I'm feeling right now, or this pattern is really hurting me. And at first, my voice was shaky through this. I wasn't used to taking up this kind of space. But the more I did it, the more I noticed something unexpected, and that was I didn't lose people the way I thought I would. See, some people leaned in, some people apologized, some people actually shared their own hidden truths. And others, yeah, they did pull away. Some even reacted defensively. But here's what really mattered most. I didn't pull away from myself. Not anymore. There are so many beautiful things that I love about my mom, for example. She's like my hero in life. Her warmth, her care, her unwavering presence. She could just light a room up by how she paid attention to you. And one of the things I admired most about her growing up was her ability to keep the peace. No matter the tension that was near, she had this gift of softening the edges. She'd absorb the conflict and smooth it out and make everyone feel held. It felt like magic at the time, kind of like a kind of emotional strength that I wanted to grow into. And I did. I watched her and I learned not just the words that she used, but the silence that she practiced, the smiles that she gave when something felt off, the way that she'd pivot to lightness when conversation got heavy. I saw how my family gravitated towards her because she made everything feel safe. So I made it my mission to be that kind of person too, to be the one who made things better. and more stable and more comfortable. What I didn't realize for the longest time was there was a cost to this though. Because while my mom, my hero in life, while her peacekeeping came from a deep place of love and wisdom, there were also moments when it meant swallowing things that should not have, that should really have been confronted. And I inherited that part too. I took it into my relationships, into my workplaces, into my communities, and eventually into my own identity as well. And it became this second nature to read a room before I read myself, to prioritize emotional safety over emotional honesty, to measure the temperature of others before checking in on how I was doing. And for a while, I wore this like a badge of honor, right? I was the level-headed one. I was the grounded one. I was one who didn't start drama, the one who could see both sides and who kept everyone steady. But deep down, I was disappearing. Because every time I stayed quiet when something in me wanted to speak up and speak out, every time I made excuses for someone's harmful behavior just to avoid conflict, every time I turned pain into this polite deflection, I wasn't keeping the peace. I was betraying myself. And that realization hit hardest, I think, in my 20s. I began to see these emotional patterns that had once felt noble, but now they were draining me. And what I'd internalized as strength was actually silence. I thought it was compassion, but often more so it was fear. And what broke my heart was realizing how much I had lost of myself in this process. It was realizing how many conversations I'd never had, how many truths I'd never spoken, how many times I'd let injustice or imbalance slide just to keep things smooth. And I thought I was protecting connection, but I was really sacrificing authenticity. And there's no intimacy where there's no truth, is there? There was this line that I could no longer cross. And so I chose to shift. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't perfect or loud, but it was necessary. And I started practicing the kind of conversations that I'd once really avoided. I allowed tension and I let awkwardness live in the room without rushing to try and clean it up. I stopped giving the safe version of what I felt and then started saying what was real to me. And the surprising thing that happened for me was the people who loved me didn't leave. They leaned in. They grew with me. They began to trust me more. Because honesty is what builds trust. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's messy, even when it disrupts the illusion of calm that we've worked so hard to maintain. The deeper truth I came to was that real peace is not the absence of conflict. Real peace is really the presence of truth with courage to hold it. It's being able to sit in the discomfort of what's real and not flinch away from it. It's loving someone enough to tell them when something is not working. And loving yourself enough to say that even if they don't like it. That's what I needed to learn. And I'll be honest, I'm still learning this lesson. But I no longer equate silence with strength anymore. I no longer equate harmony with health. I no longer equate peace with pretending. See, what I learned from my mom was powerful, but I also learned that I get to grow beyond the version of peacekeeping that I inherited. I get to grow in it with love, with reverence, with clarity. Because love without truth is not love. That's maintenance. And I don't want maintenance anymore. I want to live. And if we want to raise healthier humans, We got to build honest relationships and create spaces where people actually feel seen. We have to redefine what peace really means. Like right now, peace is too often taught as being quiet, as smiling, as getting along, as keeping things nice. And if we're equating peace with politeness and with passivity and with never saying the hard things, we're not raising emotionally grounded people. We're raising performers. We're raising people who know how to look composed while on the inner side of their world it's crumbling. People who prioritize harmony over healing. People who are becoming experts in tolerating discomfort and not really learning how to resolve it. See, I think we have to teach peace differently. We have to model it differently. Imagine if instead of saying, don't rock the boats, imagine if we asked, what waves are already under the surface that we're pretending not to feel, right? Imagine if instead of praising our young children for never causing trouble, we said, instead, thank you for speaking up. That was honest, and that's what really matters most. Imagine if we taught peace that isn't really about avoiding conflict, but about repairing connection, about staying in the relationship while telling your truth, about making room for discomfort without weaponizing that for or running from it. Real peace is not always quiet. It's not always pretty. It's often the product of tension that's been held long enough to become transformation. And that means I think we need to stop punishing people who are bringing that tension into the light. The ones who say, this doesn't feel right. Or the ones who name the unspoken, right? The ones who risk the awkward moments to create a more honest one. Because without them, all we're left with is just to pretend. I think about how many meetings and dinners and partnerships and teams and families really are operating like emotional stage plays, where everyone's reciting their part, everyone's staying in character, everyone's trying to protect the script, and what they really need is to rewrite it. But rewriting a story requires telling the truth about the one that you're presently in. It requires asking, why am I not saying, what am I not saying just so I can keep the peace? Whose comfort am I prioritizing at the cost of my own truth? What would it mean for me to say something honest and survive the fallout potentially? Or what version of peace have I inherited, and is it still working? These are not easy questions. But they are like the doorway to integrity. And integrity in its most alive form is what really turns performance into presence. I believe this deeply in the work that I'm doing here at Bintegers. I want to help people build lives that are rooted in integrity and intimacy without having to stay agreeable. It means that I'm helping them to come home to their own truth and learning to speak that truth in ways that build connection and not just compliance. It means like speaking and making peace with conflict itself, knowing that tension isn't just a sign of failure, it's a sign of the growth that's possible, that you're alive and that something real is happening and that you're transforming. And I mean, real is what we're after, isn't it? Not just the quiet or the comfort or the cohesion, but real, grounded, relational presence. Peace that can hold disagreement without disconnection. A peace that makes space for every voice, not just the convenient ones. A peace that refuses to rely on silence just to survive, because silence might preserve appearances, but it doesn't preserve the relationship. It doesn't preserve the connection, and it doesn't preserve you. So here's my invitation to you. The next time you feel that urge to smooth things over, pause there. The next time your gut tenses before your mouth opens up, listen in that moment. The next time you tell yourself it's not worth the risk, ask who's it not worth for? See, peacekeeping is not a crime. But when it comes at the cost of your voice and your boundaries and your inner clarity, it's not peace anymore. That's when it turns to pretending. And pretending will never give you the kind of connection that your soul was built for. So speak, even if it's scary to do so. Even when the room gets quiet, even when harmony feels like it's going to fade in that moment. Because sometimes real peace only begins when the pretending finally ends. I hope this episode serves you well. Let me know your thoughts, your epiphanies in the comments below.